I don't normally do this, but I thought it was a very succinct little phrase that you used in the introduction to summarize your argument. So I want to start there in asking you to explain this sentence from your new book, which is, I maintain that modern liberals, not radicals, are largely responsible for our current malaise. Could you explain your reasoning there?
Definitely, yeah. So we've had a number of books which and from all sides of the political spectrum, which suggest that radicals have somehow hijacked a previously liberal culture, and that's why we have a free speech crisis. You can read that, that comes out of Yascha Mounk's book. It comes out of Chris Rufo's book, this idea that the radicals engaged in some sort of conquest of the institutions, and my view is actually that in fact, it is left liberalism. And so what's the term liberal in the United States means leftist, but I still think it has a resonance even in Britain. Because liberalism in the 20th century means something quite different from John Stuart Mill or John Locke or these other classical liberal authors. That in the 20th century, we actually have liberalism borrowing a lot from the left. And you have a fusion of liberal and left idea, and that's modern liberalism. Now, modern liberalism is, to me, that's the real on-the-ground actual liberalism that most people in elite institutions buy into. Mm-hmm. It's not about revolution and overthrowing society and overthrowing capitalism. They've made their peace with capitalism, but it is about radical egalitarianism on culture, actually, even though that's not something they admit necessarily or are explicit about. In effect, they're okay with this creed moving to a radical place on culture. And what I'm arguing about in the book is essentially is that the majority of academia is this soft left liberalism, and those people have quite a strong demand for a narrative that centers guilt, compassion, and fear of fascism. As I'm going to leave that kind of broadly defined, fear of sliding back into essentially a white supremacy where women are in the home and homosexuals are in the closet, and that kind of slippery slope narrative. And we give an inch on that stuff, we'll be back to the bad old days. So these are sort of the lineaments of not a revolutionary worldview, the Weather Underground, Black Panther that Chris Rufo talks about. That's not really what's driving this as much as this more simple emotional identity of being a liberal, which is about, you see majorities as bad and minorities as good. You're very attentive to etiquette, taboos, and that's what drives your behavior. So it's a demand side, it's how the messages are received. So a critical race theory message on liberal ears will elicit a lot of sympathy because there's a lot of fertile soil there. There's a strong demand for those ideas.
Yeah, it's pushing on an open door. And so, Foucault, whoever have had some influence maybe, but really it's because they had the audience ready and waiting. It wasn't difficult for these radicals to get a receptive audience.
Yeah, and I guess a way I've just sort of hit on this more recently, there's a contrast in social science between sort of top-down models of behavior and emergent or bottom-up complexity theory models. So the top-down model is the Communist Party. There's a doctrine, a hymn sheet. Everybody's going to be taught that hymn sheet, and the more people you convert to that way of thinking, the more you take over the society from the top down. All the minions reflect the same worldview as the leader. That's not, in my view, how woke spreads, or really what explains its radicalization to a large extent. To a large extent, I see it more as a bottom-up phenomenon. If you think about a flock of birds, there's no bird that has the master plan. The master plan is not in the head of all the birds. What it is it's a set of very simple rules that each bird follows. It stays a certain distance away from other birds. If a predator attacks, it moves out of the way. So there are a few simple rules. And out of that simplicity emerges these complex patterns. Similarly with a market. And what's required in these complex systems is a simple rule. It might be the price signal in a marketplace. Now, what is it in terms of the woke complex? Well, so what I'm saying is you get to woke behavior, not because everyone has a plan of wanting to install critical race theory and, oh, well, socialism failed because the working class didn't rise up, so we're going to do cultural socialism. That's not, I think, how this happens. I think this largely happens because every left liberal is following a very simple rule, which is that I will not be outflanked on my sympathy for a historically marginalized group. I may even demonstrate virtue by showing how much of an ally I am to such a group. And so like these birds, what they're doing is if there's a radical that pushes the envelope, they all flock in behind. And each time there's a move, there's a flocking in behind. And so what you eventually get is this thing just ratcheting towards crazy. Now, sometimes the critical race theorists can weaponize that whole apparatus because the liberals will fall in behind the critical race theorists. But at other times, the liberalism itself can drive this process. So I think if you look at affirmative action, for example, essentially quotas for race, for gender, or if you look at political correctness, neither of those things stem from cultural Marxism of any kind. So the system can also generate its own radicalism, or it can just follow in behind a critical theorist. But the point is, it's the system and the enabling properties of that left liberal system that I'm arguing is really the driver, and not so much a few radicals.
I mean, so when you say bottom up, we're still not talking, this isn't being generated by the proletariat or whatever, right? To stick with Marxist terminology, this is still coming from an elite. It's just like a, top 20% kind of socioeconomic group. It's not designed by anyone. There's no committee, but it's not coming from the bottom of society, right?
Well, yes. I think that's true to some degree. I think it's true that these things are more intense in elite institutions. But I think it's a mistake to think that this is strictly a class phenomenon, actually. I mean, you have got some relatively poor, even not well-educated people who are pretty favorable. I mean, if you look at the survey data, you'll have plenty of people who don't have those qualifications who are pretty woke. Education level, income level are not the strongest predictors of woke attitudes. And so I think that there's more to it. Yes, of course, these things are more intense in elite environments, but I'm not as convinced that this is a sort of class signaling device. I think that comes in once the values become the esteemed values in society and the pivot of the moral order. Then yes, they become prestigious and people herd behind them for prestige reasons. But I don't think that's the driver, if I were to say.
Interesting. Contra Henderson and Goodwin. Yeah. Is it possible? So one thing that I have wondered and written about is if actually there are really two main things going on within wokeness, which come under the same banner, but actually are quite different. One is to be simplistic, one is the gender stuff and one is the race stuff. And actually the people who favour those things are quite different in that you can have, so generally these sort of, Ivy League white women that we're talking about, the sort of classic woke people, they favour both. They're woke in both ways. But you can also find people across the socioeconomic spectrum, particularly ethnic minorities, who are signed up to the race stuff, but not to the gender stuff, actually, who are signed up to BLM, say, but not to trans activism or whatever. Do you think that distinction is helpful?
I think it is helpful. I mean, these are two major fronts in the culture war, of course. Let's call them crudely critical race theory and radical gender ideology. The only thing I would say, however, is that on the gender stuff, you have a number of strands. You've got radical feminism. You have, the LGB without the T. So there's still this issue around, I know it's no longer as much of an issue, but there's still the homosexuality question, and then you've got the trans stuff. Now, within that, you've got a certain amount of tension, at least among certain elite thinkers. I don't think it translates as well to the mass, but so you have those sets of issues, and then you're right. So then the race stuff, if that takes in, Israel-Palestine, if it takes in indigenous, if it takes in immigrant, a whole bunch of categories, then I think that's another major bucket. But this all revolves really around who are the sacred totems in the system. I still think the racial totems, Black, Indigenous, sort of are the highest up the totem pole, with trans, gay, women a little lower down. I think there is a sort of a hierarchy. So, for example, I would predict that it would be easier for black feminists to break up, to split a feminist movement than for females to split a black identity movement or indigenous movement. Because of that, there's a higher point score for, I still believe that race is higher up the sacredness than sexuality or gender.
Yeah, I think historically that has generally proved to be true. Do you have any theory as to why? Is it because there's this extra support for the race element of it outside of the elite, or was something else going on?
Well, I just think these fixations arise historically as a result of events on the ground. The first thing that kicks this off, which I mentioned in the book, in a way, the civil rights movement is kind of the big bang of our moral order. The race taboo, which emerges very suddenly in the mid-'60s, and I talk about Shelby Steele's book, White Guilt, because he lived through segregation as a black American, and he talked about how the cultural power visibly, palpably shifts from white people to black people in their interactions, in terms of who has to kowtow to who in the moral order. I think that was just such a pivotal moment, a sort of critical juncture, and that sort of set the table of our moral order around. So now that sacralization of race is really the sun around which our entire moral order revolves. Now, of course, that sacred magic has been borrowed first by radical feminism and then latterly by the trans movement and the gay rights movement, or let's say. And they have a certain amount of sacredness, but I don't think they have as much as the original. And so that's sort of my theory of it. These things are quite contingent and historical. And also these groups, politically, black people can organize, that they could have an impact on the culture. If we take a group such as people who are mentally ill or not very intelligent, their ideological use and their political utility is lower because they have less organizing capacity. Their stories are not circulated. They don't live as much in the culture. So I think myths and symbols from these movements are also very important in reproducing the whole moral order that we live in.
And I think also that intra-ethnic solidarity tends to be stronger than intra-sex solidarity. Like people feel more of a, you probably quote these numbers in your book, I forget now, but the fact that actually white liberals don't really have any intra-ethnic solidarity. Like white liberals generally dislike their racial group, but other racial groups tend to quite clearly and vocally favour their own group. And so it's fairly easy to sort of encourage people to organise on those lines. I don't think women really have that. It's not, apart from, you will occasionally hear feminist rhetoric to this effect. But the idea that women all have this kind of unifying feminine energy which binds them together, I just think is not true. I don't think people function like that.
Look at how few women identify as a feminist. Single digits in most places. I think, there is a female identity, but in terms of, myths and symbols that transcend generations that are attached to civilizational story, it's just weaker, I would say, in terms of an organizing unit. So that would be one reason is it may be less useful then for political movements.